some group that would like to see the state take over the natural gas pipeline. Would that fall under the category of nationalize, or is that a different structure?
Well, then, you could do that. You could have a state owned and run just like a state port authority. Uh, Chances are this any big natural gas pipeline, a big one that is, would lose money. A small one, it should do okay. But I'm talking 18-inch, 100 BCF a year, whereas these big ones are 4 BCF a day. Um, and the LNG project, you're competing with the world on that project. Now, you might be able to get a long-term contract from, say, Japan or even China. Uh, the way that the U.S. and China is going, you can't trust China. Not that they aren't trustworthy. It's just that because of all this infighting, you got to be careful with China. And then Japan, you could probably get a long-term contract, but it won't be full the whole time. That is, they have their seasons of high need and seasons of low need. So it's going to be hard to be cost competitive getting to Japan, even compared to the Gulf of Mexico. You can get around through the Panama Canal, although that's lately been hard to get through. If the Panama Canal is working, you can get through from the Gulf of Mexico to Japan cheaper than building a pipeline here and getting to Japan.
Well, it's a nice transition to something else that's interesting. When we're talking about LNG, and we can perhaps find a buyer in Asian markets, that would be dependent on long-term contracts, as you mentioned, and those long-term contracts are based on some negotiated price. Well, we usually predict oil prices at the state level. We use that to guide where we're headed with our policy. And I would make the argument that futures are a terrible predictor of future prices. Um, and and so what I mean by that is Japan, if the spot price of LNG is $3, there's not a lot of incentive of making it of locking in a contract at $20. It doesn't, but that's not reflective of the price possibly going to $20. So today, there's very little incentive for somebody to write a futures contract at $80 or $90 a barrel, especially not at 110. But that is trying to predict a future price with current conditions, and there's just very little incentive to write those contracts to predict future oil prices. Does that make any sense, or am I
Oh
way
yeah,
off?
yeah. No, most people aren't. There's some contracts out, say 5, 10 years, but there's very few contracts, and the only ones that do it are, I don't know, not just speculators. There's maybe a few refineries or airlines or something, but very few people are making those kinds of contracts. Now with LNG, it used to be you'd have 10, 20-year contracts, and Japan did it a lot because they wanted to make sure they had the supply, and it was hard to build these systems up. Now they're trying to make it more competitive. It's very hard to get a long run contract for LNG at a higher price. LNG goes for what, say in the Gulf at $3 to $5 per MCF compared to, and that's, it's hard to compare natural gas to oil because they're at different price levels and different densities. But anyway, yeah, it's going to be a challenge to get a long run. You almost need a long run price contract in LNG to make anything work. Now in oil, nobody's doing that. They rarely do that, and you get surprised. I think we're in for a surprise. We probably could be in this surprise with the oil price in Alaska's favor, obviously, if it goes up.
Correct. And so that's one of the things I like to keep in mind. I'm glad that you clarified some of that up for some of the industry. I would have found that to be the opposite between LNG and oil, but I'm glad that you clarified that a little bit.